I'm Cynthia Garcia, the Contract Manager and Contact at the California Air Resources Board for this project, and I welcome you to the Environmental Justice Screening Method webinar, hosted by the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, known as PERE, and the California Air Resources Board. Before I proceed with further introductions, I would like to go through some safety and housekeeping announcements. Please look around now and identify 2 exits closest to you. In the event of a fire alarm, we are required to evacuate this room. Please take your valuables with you and do not use the elevators. Evacuees will exit down the stairways and possibly to a relocation site across the street. The drinking fountains and restrooms are located out the doors at the back of the room. Go to the left. Over the last 7 years, the Air Resources Board has supported the development of the Environmental Justice Screening Method, referred as EJSM, a mapping method that identifies communities in California facing the highest cumulative impact of environmental hazards, health risks, and social stressors, and has supported PERE's work with environmental justice communities and public agencies. This project has been possible through the work and dedication of Jim Sad of Occidental College and his colleagues Rachel Morello-Frosch of UC Berkeley and Manuel Pastor of USC. In this webinar, Jim Sad and Madeline Wonder will highlight recent methodology improvements and results, and will also compare results using regional and statewide scoring approaches, compare the EJSM to alternative screening methods like the CalEnviroScreen 2, and discuss EJSM implications. Dr. Jim Sad is a professor of the environmental science at Occidental College, Los Angeles, California. Over the past 15 years, his research has focused on the quantitative and spatial evaluation of questions related to environmental exposure, health risk, and environmental justice, primarily through the use of spatial analysis using geographic information systems and remote sensing tools. He recently served the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as a member of the Nationally Consistent Environmental Justice Screening Approaches Workgroup, and is currently serving on the EPA Science Advisory Board Environmental Justice Technical Guidance Review Panel. He has worked extensively with community-based organizations throughout California to pioneer a community-based participatory research model called ground truthing, to quantitatively ground truth some of the secondary data sources on which screening tools are based. Madeline Wonder is a data analyst at the USC PERE, directed by Manuel Pastor. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from UCLA and a BA in urban and environmental policy from Occidental College. She conducts qualitative and quantitative research, and her work focuses on environmental justice, transportation equity, and social movement buildings. At the end of this presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. Please send your emails to sierrarm@calipa.ca.gov, and you should be seeing it right now in your webinar. Thank you. So please welcome Jim Sad and Madeline Wonder.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good morning, everyone. This morning, we're going to be talking about the environmental justice screening method, and particularly the work that we've done over the past 2 years to expand it statewide, and also to make certain improvements in the data and the methodology. So we've divided this talk into 2 parts. One is to review the EJ screening method, talk about updates that we've done to the data, and also give you a look into preliminary results of a new metric that we're developing under in a separate way, not part of this contract, but one that will eventually be added to the EJ screening method to track drinking water quality and vulnerability. In the second part of the talk, we'll be talking in somewhat more detail about issues of data accuracy, the details of an enhanced spatial approach to look at hazard proximity, and then a comparison with 2 other screening methods, CalEnviroScreen and CEVA from UC Davis. So, as background for the EJ screening method, the rationale for screening, and particularly EJSM, is the desire on the part of many stakeholders to have tools that would better address cumulative impacts as defined by not only exposure to multiple environmental hazards, but also attention to the social stressors that are linked to health disparities in research that's been done by our social science colleagues. It turns out that traditional risk assessment techniques don't really consider risks cumulatively or their effects. They don't take into account potential interactions of multiple exposures, and then don't take into account the socioeconomic stressors either. So our contribution to this effort has been the development of a cumulative impact screening method, which we call the EJSM. It's place-based, and it looks at measures or proxies of environmental hazard and risk, and also metrics of vulnerability and resilience, and uses geographic techniques to compare and integrate them together in order to look for hotspots that may be of interest to both communities or the regulatory community. In this project, we've updated the EJSM to use the best quality metrics and the most current ones available, and also expanded the data to cover California statewide. So the EJSM has always had a number of goals, and one is to take the secondary data sets that are available and use them together, but use them as they've been vetted by a variety of stakeholders at different levels. So we want to select the data sets that we're using, but we want to make sure these data sets are relevant to the different stakeholder communities that might be interested in the EJSM results. We also have striven to use neighborhoods as our unit of analysis. One of the problems with doing any sort of spatial analysis is the problem of how granular the data is, and you can't, you don't want to try to be so granular that you're really misrepresenting precision. And so what we've done is we've actually started with land use in our spatial model in order to take into account CARB's interest in sensitive land uses and also residential land use as possible targets of exposure to multiple hazards, and also subject to vulnerability and resilience variation. That variation in resilience and vulnerability are best proxied or best captured by the social determinants of health that give us indicators of those conditions. And finally, the goal for a screening method like this is to identify hotspots for regulatory attention and for additional study. Perhaps, for example, to concentrate resources or concentrate investigation on these areas that are probably most likely to require more understanding. So in the environmental justice screening method, what we do is we've developed indicators of cumulative impact that come from the current research on both the environmental and the social determinants of health. We've selected them such that we are using publicly available information so it can be replicated and used by others. We want to use them in a transparent way, and also develop those indicators in a way that's relevant to a variety of stakeholder groups, from policymakers to regulators to affected communities. And the EJ screening method has applicability for a variety of purposes. It's being used for a land use ordinance in Los Angeles. It could be used to just make decisions on funding allocations or regulatory decision making, and certainly for outreach and engagement with communities. So during development of the EJ screening method throughout its 7-year history, we've had a number of different stakeholder groups that we have involved from the beginning at different stages during the process to make sure that we are vetting the data that we're using correctly, that the data is relevant to these different stakeholder groups, and their feedback on indicators and data inputs and methodology have been critical to the method as it's been put together. And that process has been an iterative one, so we've done it throughout the development of the method. And as a further way of engaging communities in this process, we've actually involved them in a series of ground truthing efforts to compare the EJ screening method results to actual conditions on the ground in over 20 different areas in California. So in our current iteration of the EJ screening method, I guess we could call it version 3.0, we have statewide coverage. As always, the scoring for EJSM focuses on places where people live. That's because of its origin in land use information. It screens using a variety of indicators, which Madeline is going to be going over as we go forward. The initial analysis is at the most granular level we can, and so that is a combination of land use information and census block information. And then the scoring and mapping is all done aggregated up to census tracts, as is found in most screening methods, either statewide or national. And all of our scores are done consistently using a quintile distribution of indicators. So indicator metrics are divided into 5 quintiles, the lowest 20%, the highest 20%, and those 3 in between. And those are what is used in the scoring throughout. And finally, we have data coverage statewide, but the scoring that we prefer and we think is most relevant is scoring done by region. And these regions show the regional scoring that the EJSM does. These regions were selected in consultation with CARB as part of this project. We have 5 categories of cumulative impact and vulnerability in the EJ screening method, the first of which is values which reflect the proximity to a variety of environmental hazards and sensitive land uses. The hazards that we've selected are the ones that reflect the concerns and the priorities in CARB's 2005 Land Use and Air Quality Handbook and further discussion with them. And the second of the 5 categories are health risk and exposure indicators that come from a variety of data sources, both statewide and national. There are indicators of social and health vulnerability. These are metrics that we've taken from the epidemiological literature on the social determinants of health and are sourced from the American Community Survey, a 5-year roll-up, as you'll see, and also a variety of state and other municipal data sources. We have a category for climate change vulnerability, which again is looking at health impacts from the climate change and health literature. It's really focused on increase in temperature, the effects of heat islands in urban areas, and also metrics of vulnerability and resilience as they vary among populations with SES. And finally, we're developing a drinking water indicator, taking data and a lot of guidance from OEHA, and those are metrics that are also been vetted with stakeholder input. So, without further ado, Madeline will now discuss the various categories and how they work with the EJ screening method.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I just wanted to be clear that the 5th layer, the water metric, we haven't folded into our cumulative impact score yet. And after I go through the 4 categories that are currently in the CI scoring, Jim will cover what we're doing with water after that. So I'll just go layer by layer and talk a bit about the updates we did to the data. And then the second part of our talk will be addressing the updates we did with the methods. So for the first category or layer, it's proximity to hazards and land uses. And what we've done is the bullets highlighted in yellow are either the data sets that we updated or added. So for the first layer, hazard proximity, we replaced the AB 2588 and chrome platers data set that was originally used in the EJSM with 2 data sets. The first is something we call facilities of interest given to us by CARB, and this is taking facilities from 2 different data sets. The first is the greenhouse gas mandatory reporting database under AB 32, and the second is from the CEDARS database. The other data set that we added is something we're calling industry-wide data layers, and we originally had 5 regional industry-wide data layers in there. Auto paint and body shops, gas stations, hazardous waste sites, dry cleaners, and printing and publishing. We've since removed dry cleaners and printing and publishing, so we still have those top 3 in there. And then we've stuck with our original land use sources data set. So this is looking at rail facilities, ports, airports, refineries, intermodals, and also a metric looking at traffic volume. And then we also are looking at sensitive land uses as well, as defined by CARB, since we know that there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to exposure to hazardous sites. So this is child care facilities, healthcare and senior housing facilities, schools, playgrounds, and then residential neighborhoods. So like I said, we've done a lot of updates to our methods, particularly for this layer, so we'll go over that shortly. But just to get to the results, the maps. So we're going to be displaying 3 different regions for our updates by way of example, but like Jim said, we've done this for all 8 of the regions that we've identified throughout the state. So these are the results for the first layer, the hazard proximity layer in the Bay Area region. And like Jim was saying, we quintile the results. So we're ranking tracts within the Bay Area against each other. That's what we mean by regional scoring. So this is what it looks like in the Bay Area for just the first layer of the EJSM. This is what it looks like in the San Joaquin Valley. And this is what it looks like in the Southern California region, which includes Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, and then the Inland Empire.
I just want to add here that the maps that we're showing, we've done, as Madeline said, for all regions in California. And we've created, actually Madeline has created a PDF document which has all of those maps that will be distributed to everyone who's a participant on this webinar.
Great. So the second layer is the health risk and exposure. So we've updated a lot of the data in this layer. We've updated the risk screening environmental indicators, or the RISI data set, to the 2007 through 10, looking at average toxic concentration hazard scores. We've updated the particulate matter concentration as well as the ozone concentration. We're still using the respiratory hazard and cancer risk data from NADA 2005. I was on a webinar yesterday with US EPA, and they said 2011 should be coming anytime, so we will definitely integrate that when it does. And then the last is the pesticide applications, updated that as well. So this is what it looks like in the Bay Area. In the San Joaquin Valley, and then in Southern California. And we can definitely go over these maps again if folks have questions during Q&A. So the third layer is social and health vulnerability. So we pretty much just updated the vulnerability indicators to the most recent ACS 2008 through 12. That was the most recent when we were updating it. We'll do the same for 2013. So the three buckets that we're looking at here are first socioeconomic vulnerability. So looking at percent people of color, percent living in poverty, home ownership rates, median housing values, and educational attainment. For biological vulnerability, like I mentioned before, looking at percent of children as well as seniors, and then some birth outcome data as well. And then finally looking at civic engagement capacity, really trying to measure political vulnerability. So the two indicators we have in there are linguistic isolation, and then voter turnout, and this is where we added some more data from more recent elections. So we have a sample size from 2004, 6, 8, and 10 to look at voter turnout there. So here's what it looks like in the Bay Area. And again, this is regional scoring, so we're just comparing tracts within these regions to each other at this point. This is the San Joaquin Valley. And then here's what it looks like in Southern California. And then the final layer, I'll turn to Jim to talk a bit about.
Okay, there's a lot of interest in adding climate change vulnerability on the part of stakeholders that are interested in the EJ screening method, and so we've developed a climate change vulnerability category. And really this addresses the primary negative health impact of climate change that can be detected and studied and understood in California, and that's the effect of heat stress on populations during summertime heat events. And it turns out that one of the most reliable metrics of this is, again, land use. So these are bar graphs for 4 different MSAs in California, showing variation in both the percent impervious surface and also tree canopy. This is information that comes from the National Land Cover Data Set from the U.S. Geological Survey. And the trend, although the absolute values are different in these different areas, the trends are the same, which is in areas of relatively low SES, you have higher impervious surface and lower tree canopy, and so there would be a more intense urban heat island effect in those neighborhoods than in high SES areas. So in order to try to capture this, we have 3 different categories of climate change impact and vulnerability indicators. The first are the heat island risk, the ones that I just described. The second are measures in temperature. We're looking at the projected monthly max temperature over for the midpoint in the century. We're also looking at the change in that temperature over the first 50 years, and also new for this project, the change in the number of degree days of warm nights, because one of the primary and the strongest signals of increase in temperature has been higher temperatures at night rather than at other times during the day. We also have 2 metrics of vulnerability and resilience, that is percent elderly living alone, and also car ownership, both coming from the American Community Survey. And this reflects what the California Department of Public Health has seen in examining mortality during heat stress events. Primarily, the mortality has been visited on the elderly, and mostly these are elderly who are living alone. There's no one checking on them, and so they are more likely to get into trouble and suffer in that way. And car ownership is a measure of resilience, because if you have a car, you're more likely to be able to go to a place where it's cooler, either a local cooling center or even out of the region. So if we look at the maps for those same geographic areas of our climate indicator, here it is for the ABAG or San Francisco Bay Area, mostly concentrated in the areas where the social vulnerability indicator and the land use indicators are sort of taking over, so the most urbanized part of the Bay Area. Here it is for the San Joaquin Valley and for the Southern California region.
Great. So putting it all together to get our cumulative impact score. Again, we do total cumulative impact scores at the tract level. What we do is we simply sum up the scores that the tracts got in each of the layers. So each tract got a score from 1 to 5 for each of the layers. We add that up, and that's the cumulative impact score. So that's why you'll see on the maps that tracts the scores range from 3 to 15 when we exclude climate change vulnerability, and range from 4 to 20 when we include climate change vulnerability. And we show both because there's been interest in seeing it with and without climate change vulnerability. So here are the results for the total cumulative impact score for the Bay Area, and this is excluding climate change vulnerability. And here we're showing comparisons of regional versus statewide scoring. So you'll see in the Bay Area, in the regional scoring, there are more tracts that show up red. And that's because we're just comparing tracts within the Bay Area to one another. When we go to statewide scoring and we compare tracts in the Bay Area for the CI score without climate change to those, let's say, in the San Joaquin Valley or Southern California, it dilutes a bit. So here's the comparison. And this is with climate change vulnerability. So here's the Bay Area with cumulative impact score with climate change vulnerability and without. Here's what it looks like in the San Joaquin Valley. Again, the CI score excluding climate change, regional versus statewide. And this is including climate change vulnerability in the valley, regional versus statewide. And then the final region we're comparing, Southern California. This is without the CI score, without climate change vulnerability. And then this is including climate change vulnerability, both comparing regional and statewide scoring. Now looking at it statewide, again, we're going to show with and without climate change vulnerability. The map on the left might be a little confusing. What this is showing is regional scoring for each of the 8 regions that we've divided the state into. So this is comparing tracts just within those regions, but showing it statewide. And then the statewide scoring where we're comparing all tracts in the state to one another. And then same with the CI score, including climate change vulnerability.
One of the strengths we think of the EJ screening method throughout has been the flexibility that users have to use or not use different classes of indicators. And so we've added a class of indicators to track water quality and vulnerability to drinking water threats. It hasn't been included in the maps that we've shown so far, but it can be included in the scoring and in maps that are done going forward. Excuse me. So the water quality metric actually is defined using 4 different drinking water metrics. The first is the concentration of various contaminants. There are 17 that are typically monitored and measured in drinking water sampling. And for this, we're using the 17 most commonly occurring contaminants because looking at water quality testing statewide. About 80% of water quality, water systems statewide have testing for these 17 contaminants. Another piece of the water metrics, water quality score that we're using, another metric, is what we're calling technical, managerial, and financial capacity of the water system. So this is based on the idea that a larger water system that serves a larger number of users has greater technical and managerial and financial capacity, and so less vulnerability to problems. We're also looking at a metric of physical vulnerability to outages, and this is really having to do with whether it's a combination of ground and surface water, only surface water, or only groundwater used, and the number of wells. So the idea here is if a system is only on groundwater, and if it's depending on fewer wells, it is more physically vulnerable to outages, contamination from underground sources, and so forth. And then we have a final metric, which is the compliance burden metric. And this has to do with numbers of monitoring and reporting violations that are done, that have been reported for water systems, and also those for which we have no water quality data. So this is a listing of the 17 contaminants that are used in the first part of that metric, and the ones that we have data for 80% or more of the different community water systems statewide. And just to give you a feeling for how this looks when we map it, this is only the water quality metric mapped for the state of California, both statewide and regional. If you look at the statewide scoring on the right, you can see that Northern California and the Eastern Sierra generally have lower water quality scores than the rest of the state, but using regional scoring, the hot spots of each region are lifted up by map color. And looking at one of those regions, here's Sacramento, you can see the variation there too. Notice that the urbanized area of Sacramento is relatively low in terms of its water quality score, which makes sense because that's where the best water quality system is. And we're still working on ways in which to add vulnerability to the scores and to the maps. And so here what we've done is we've shaded, this is the same maps that we've shown here with the colors from 1 to 5. But here there's been an overlay of shading to indicate the areas where there's a vulnerability concern. And here, again, as you can see in the Sacramento area, there's a lower vulnerability in the highly urbanized area of the city of Sacramento than there is for SACOG generally. So we've ended the first part of our talk, and we now will go into looking at data accuracy and ground truthing and comparison of screening methods. So if you'll recall, this is the listing that Madeline shared with you of the data inputs that we use for hazard proximity. And because we were using some different data, much better data sets, in fact, than the ones we used before, we wanted to make sure that these data were accurate in terms of activity and location. And in doing some preliminary analysis, we found that there were some concerns. To give you an example of what that looks like, here's a hazardous waste site, the Southern California Gas Resource Conservation and Recovery Act site. It has a reported location in downtown Los Angeles, which is shown there. We're looking at Google Earth Pro, which is one of the tools we used for data validation. But if you actually geocode the address, you can see that the address geocodes about 10 miles away in Pico Rivera. And looking, sort of zooming into that area, you can see, in fact, that that's where the facility is. So we did encounter some problems with some of the reported locations of these sites, and so went ahead and validated all of them. And you can see here that the geocode and the center of the land use, of the parcel that is this RCRA site are both shown as points. They're not really in the center of the RCRA site, but somewhat off-center. If we then use that as a point from which to measure at different distances the presence of sensitive land uses or residential land uses, you can see that this actually matters, because right here where the actual site is, it's right adjacent to single-family homes. However, if you think about this, there's really only a part of that facility that really contains the hazardous waste. And so a better model is actually probably using or depicting in the analysis and interpretation of these hazards, depicting them as polygons rather than points, and then measuring from the polygon edge. So we feel this ground truthing, hazard location, and validation is important. And in looking at, for example, the CARB FOI data set, we call it the FOI data set, although I think that that's probably not fashionable in California, although I don't partake of it myself. The FOI data set, as you can see, is mostly reasonably correct, but there were some facilities that were mislocated. So we looked at the error rate for all of these different data sets, and we found that in general, for hazardous waste and the FOI data set, about 20% were off by at least 1,000 feet. A smaller number were off by greater, but here we're using 1,000 and 2,000 and 3,000 feet as our thresholds because these are the buffers that we use in our hazard proximity calculation. And so this locational inaccuracy matters, and it matters to the score, and you would result in a different score if you use the data uncorrected. For gas stations, there was a very large number, and we hadn't planned for this in the project. So we took a 10% random selection and tested those and found a very low error rate. And this makes sense because this information actually came from a different data source, which is much more reliable and much more accurate and checked at the county level. And so we were comfortable with that. So given that now we have the new data and we've checked it for accuracy, Madeline will discuss with you the improvements in the methods for hazard proximity.
Okay, and this is probably the most technical or nerdy part of the presentation. So some of you are going to love it, some of you won't, but I'll go as quickly as I can. But we get questions about the method and how we measure hazard proximity, so we thought it important to include this in this conversation. So to understand how we measure hazard proximity, it's important to understand the underlying architecture of the EJSM. So what we start with is, like Jim was saying, a very fine-grain level of geography. We start with land use parcels, basically residential and sensitive land uses. We call these CI polys, so when you see that in the presentation and when I say it, just remember that it's a residential parcel or a sensitive land use parcel that we've attached census data to that allows us to aggregate up later. But that's what CI poly is, just the parcel that we start with from which we measure the proximity to hazards. Once we start with this, we then put it into some statistical programming. We use SPSS to do the data processing, and that's where we generate the CI scores and aggregate it up to the tract level. And then the third step is the GIS mapping of the CI scores that you saw in the first part of the talk. So from the very beginning, this layer, the hazard proximity layer, has been really important to the communities that have been involved in the development of the EJSM. However, the way that we were originally doing it was pretty cumbersome. It's very time-consuming. The tools fairly limited. So we needed to find a simpler, faster, and more flexible way to do this, to calculate the hazard proximity layer. So what we originally did, which usually comes to mind, is using the buffer tool in our map software. So what we did is we drew 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 foot buffers around each of the CI polys. And this is thousands and thousands and thousands of polys. And what we did is we counted the hazards within each of those buffers, and then we distance weight them, meaning those hazards that are closer to the CI polys get a higher score. Because they're more detrimental. And this made sense in theory, but it is, like I said, really limited and frankly would just crash computers a lot. It's pretty hard to use. You'd have to split up the data set and so forth. So we came up with a way that takes this process from a multi-day process to a 15-minute process. We now use something called the point distance tool within ArcGIS or our map software. And what this does is it measures the distance between 2 points. So what we did is within a certain threshold that you can set. So what we did was we measured the distance between the CI poly centroids, the middle of the poly, and all the hazards within 4,000 feet. And what this does is it spits out this table that shows the distance relationship between the CI polys, or these residential parcels, and all the hazards within 4,000 feet. We can then feed this into our statistical programming, and in our programming with just one line of code, build these buffers, the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 foot buffers, count the hazards within those buffers, buffers, distance weight them, and it's really cut down a ton of time. There were 2 issues, though, that came up with using this, and we've gotten questions about this, so we thought we would just address it up front. The first is that we found that this method works pretty well for those small polygons, but there's limitations with the larger polygons. Since we're measuring the distance between the middle or the centroid of the polygon and the hazards, with the small polygons, it would go outside of the polygon, but what we found, like the schematic shows, with some of the polygons, the 1,000-foot buffer from the centroid would sometimes not even go outside the polygon, like the original buffer would do. So we did 2 things. First, we cut down the size of the polygons by laying a grid, or what we call a fishnet, over them, so we just cut them down in size. But that still didn't account for the area of the polygon that we were losing when we dropped the buffer tool and started using the point distance tool. This schematic shows that with the buffer tool, we were measuring the distance between the hazards and the CI poly by using the outside of the polygon, but with the new point distance tool, we're using the centroid, or the middle dot. And so what this shows is that by using the point distance tool, we were creating a gap. So with using the buffer tool, we would have caught this hazard when we built the 3,000-foot buffer, but using the point distance tool, we wouldn't have caught this hazard that was within that same 3,000-foot buffer. So what we do is, this is probably the nerdiest slide, is we add the radius of a circle that has the same area as the CI poly to the distance that the point distance tool churns out. I'm happy to go into this in more depth for people who are interested, but that's how we made up for the gap that we lost when we went to the point distance tool. And then the final step is aggregating up. So this is a question we get a lot. How do you then get a hazard proximity score for a tract when we're using these small little residential parcels? So this is a schematic just to show how we do this. So we start with the tract, and let's say that there's 4 blocks within this tract, and they have hazard counts of 4, 5, 2, and 4 respectively. We then population weight these scores when we aggregate up. So we divide the tract population, we put the percent of the tract population that lives in each block, so 40%, 10%, and so forth, and then we population weight it, so we follow that calculation that's at the bottom. So this tract would get a hazard proximity score of 4, and so then we rank these scores against each other, and that's how we end up with the final hazard proximity score ranked into quintiles.
As Madeline mentioned, this point distance method runs a lot more quickly, but it's also a lot more flexible because we're using buffers that are 1 and 2 and 3,000 feet. We've chosen those because those are the ones that are recommended by CARB land use recommendations. But if you wanted to change those buffers, you could simply do it in the SPSS programming in a moment and rerun the point distance tool and have that information. So it's much more flexible and much more useful going forward, in addition to being a lot easier and a lot faster. To give you some look into how much this changes the scoring using the new method over the old method, here's the hazard proximity and land use score for Los Angeles County using the old buffer method. And if we compare that to the same score in Los Angeles County using the point distance new method, you can see that there is some change. And it's a little hard to sort of understand what that change is. So this is sort of a net change map of that same area. So the areas that are in red have had their score increased as a result of using the new method. The areas that are in green have had their scores decreased as a result of the new method. You can see that the areas that now score higher are areas that are smaller and more urban and better represented by the point distance method. And the ones that have lost score are probably the ones that are less of a concern in terms of hazard proximity. These would be very large census tracts outside of the urban centers. The reason I think that these were given higher scores before is that they are so big that it was more likely that they would be near a hazard simply because of their size. And the point distance method, to a great degree, reverses that. So finally, we'd like to talk a little bit about comparing the EJ screening method to the two other screening methods that have been used in California that are similar. CalEnviroScreen from Cal EPA OEHA, and that's version 2. And also the Cumulative Environmental Vulnerabilities Assessment that is done by UC Davis. Now, there's a lot of similarity in these three methods and also some key differences. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about those similarities and differences. But again, we've prepared a PDF document that will be distributed to everyone, which contains a lot more detail about this comparison. One of the ways in which you can compare these three methods is in the metrics that they use. And certainly, there's lots of overlaps in using common metrics, but there are some important differences in the metrics that each of these tools have chosen. So for example, the EJ screening method considers land use in a variety of ways and also has climate change impact indicators as well, which the other two methods don't. All three methods do think about and consider hazard proximity, but they do it in very different ways, and they use different methods. As far as using the US EPA National Air Toxics Assessment information, the EJ screening method carries from that estimated cancer risk and respiratory hazard, whereas CalEnviroScreen uses it only for diesel PM 2.5 concentrations. And finally, some of the indicators that the three methods use for socioeconomic vulnerability and resilience vary. There's a variation in indicators that try to capture civic engagement and also variation in those metrics that try to capture health status. So, in short, lots of overlap, but some important differences in metrics. There are also differences in the ways in which information that is derived from the metrics is merged in order to show it at different levels of geography. So this really starts with the spatial unit that's used for analysis and scoring and mapping among the three methods. For CES and for CEVA, they both use census tract polygons throughout their method of analysis and scoring and presentation of mapping, whereas with the EJ screening method, as Madeline has pointed out, we start out at a much more granular level using land use information. The type of land use information that we use varies depending on where in the state we are. There are some areas for which we have very good municipally provided land use maps and data, but for other areas we were required to use tax parcels. Tax parcels contain land use information with them, something called the use code. It does vary from county to county, but we worked through those problems. And there is a step in the EJ screening method where we population weight the hazard proximity, as Madeline described, in order to use census block population to population weight those hazard proximity scores up to the tract level. But eventually all that information is aggregated at the tract level, and that's where the rest of the analysis and scoring in the EJSM is done as well. The differences that I'm discussing affect the map pattern independent of differences in the scoring approach or the indicators that these methods use. So things to watch out for would include the following. One is that tracts vary in size a lot because population density varies a lot. And so sometimes you'll look at a map and the pattern will seem misleading because there's lots of color or it's very obvious in the rural areas or the open space areas just because they're larger and they tend to dominate the map pattern. With the EJ screening method, we've tried to correct for that a little bit or keep that to be less confusing by providing land use masks. So we simply mask out all of the areas that are not sensitive land uses or residential land in order to focus on the EJSM scores that are just in the places where people live or that are sensitive. And finally, the way in which map color is used in these different methods will also affect the map pattern and can affect the interpretation of it. So with CalEnviroScreen, for example, there are 20 colors, but each of those colors represents the same number of census tracts statewide. In the EJSM, we have 13 colors, or a larger number if we use a larger number of indicators. But instead of all of the colors being represented with the same number of tracts statewide, it actually follows a bell-shaped curve where the very highest scores and the very lowest scores are for a relatively small number of tracts, and the scores in the middle are for the most. And if you think about it, that's probably the way in which vulnerability and risk is actually distributed. And finally, with CEVA, they actually take a very different approach and use a 3x3 scoring matrix, which affects the map pattern and the colors used and the way in which a map might be interpreted. Finally, there are differences in the way scores are calculated. The three methods use different numbers of indicators, summarized again in that PDF document that you all will get. And they also differ in how those different indicator metrics are grouped together for scoring. And so what this does is it actually, for each method, there's a different weighting or a different weight attached to the final score that is determined by each of those individual metrics. That weighting is implicit. It's not placed there because we think one metric is more important than the other, but it's because of the way in which the metrics are grouped together. So just to remind you, the way in which scoring is done in the three methods with the EJ screening method, we quintile rank all metrics in each category in a linear way. Then these are summed and re-ranked to give us our 1 to 5 score that then are collected at the end. So with the EJSM, we have a score that is open-ended, and as additional indicator categories are added, the number of scores will increase, but the distribution will be the same. And of course, we've always preferred regional scoring because we think understanding these issues at a regional level makes more sense. With CalEnviroScreen, the two indicator categories which they use to combine their different metrics are multiplied by one another in order and yield a continuous number, a continuous score, which is open-ended. They take those scores and they divide them up into percentiles, from 20 percentiles, and so there's the same number of tracks in each one of those percentile ranks, and they score at the statewide level. With CEVA, as I mentioned, they use a 3x3 scoring matrix which tracks impact and vulnerability along two different axes, and they've applied their method only to selected regions in the state. So if we take a look at some maps to compare these two, this is the EJ screening method CI score without climate statewide. So this is considering the entire state without regional scoring for the EJ screening method. And the best comparison of CalEnviroScreen to this is to take CalEnviroScreen's statewide scores and map those, but divide them up into 13 classes instead of the 20 that CalEnviroScreen uses. So what we've done is we've taken that continuous score and just put it into 13 bins instead of into 20 bins. And so comparing those two maps looks like this. And there's a difference. If you look at the EJSM maps, there's a lot less red and a lot less orange than in the CalEnviroScreen. And the reason for that, again, I'll remind you, is because with CalEnviroScreen, there's the same number of tracks for each one of those scores from 1 to 13. But for the EJ screening method, there's far fewer tracks that are very low in score or very high in score. And that's why you see that difference in pattern. Here then is again, that EJ screening method CI scores as is done, looking at it statewide. And here is the CalEnviroScreen scores, but this time what we've done is we forced them into a bell curve. So we forced them into a curve where the medium values have a much larger number of tracks than the ones at the two extremes. And when you compare those two, they're a lot more similar to one another. And I think most importantly, they show that the areas that are the hot spots of the state are in the same place. The Central Valley, Southern California, parts of Sandag, parts of ABAG, and also the inland or the eastern part of Southern California. Just to see how this looks regionally, here is the EJSM statewide score, but looking only at the ABAG San Francisco Bay region. This is done statewide. If we take those CalEnviroScreen scores, put them into 13 categories, and force them into the bell curve, this is what CalEnviroScreen looks like. So this is the most direct comparison on a regional level for CalEnviroScreen versus EJSM. So that would be these two. And finally, this would be our preferred way of thinking about cumulative impact and vulnerability for the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the EJSM regional score done just regionally and not using a statewide analysis. So we've talked to you for a long time. We've given you a lot of information, and we're sure you have a lot of questions. So we thank you very much and appreciate your attention, and would be happy to address those questions at this point.
You have any questions? I'll come over. Any questions?
Hi, Jim. So,
Good morning.
I was interested in the climate change vulnerability layer. So you have you had metrics, at least one metric for elderly people, and that that is certainly one of the vulnerable populations. I think you had the percentage of elderly people living alone. One of the real vulnerable populations that I think of is outdoor workers. I don't know if there have you thought about a layer that would specifically measure that?
I think that's a really good idea and an important one, because outdoor workers would certainly, you would think, would be more vulnerable to temperature and urban heat island effects. What we were looking for were data sources that would help us understand that. And the American Community Survey did have these metrics, but what we need to do is look for some source of data that's statewide that might be able, help us capture outdoor workers. And, off the top of my head, I don't know where we would start in that, but that's certainly something we should put on the list for improving the climate change vulnerability metric.
Hi, while we're on climate change and heat, we've actually been looking at also at urban heat island issues, and had worked with a contractor who was doing atmospheric modeling of urban heat islands. And the results of that project surprised some of us quite a bit, because you think about urban heat islands as being right where there's a lot of impervious surface and not a lot of trees. And what his analysis found is that the urban heat island is often quite a bit downwind of that, because there's airflow that basically moves the heat to other zones. And so the urban heat island is created in one location and actually manifests from a public health perspective in a different location. That's causing us a little bit of interest as we try to figure out how to address that. So for example, in the Bay Area, the biggest urban heat island is right around the base of Mount Diablo and Walnut Creek, according to his analysis. And same kind of thing in San Diego, where you see it right up, right up against the mountains. In LA, you see it definitely out in the San Bernardino area. And so that's just something to throw into the mix as you think about both the areas where urban heat islands are created, and then the areas where people may be most feeling the effects of them.
That's really fascinating, actually.
And we'll be making those results public. We're doing an internal peer review now, and they'll be coming out fairly soon.
I look forward to learning about that. And that's really interesting too, because that's exactly what we see with health risk, because the air pollution is produced in one area, but then it blows downwind and actually concentrates in the downwind. So that's a really important point, and one we've got to think about in our in that indicator.
This is just the wind pattern that in the Bay Area that Jim was just referring to. That results in the scores that we see for this layer.
But if we can understand that relationship, then we can use wind information in order to try to model it.
Hey, Jim. Good to see you again, and a nice presentation. Shankar Prasad from OHIA.
Great to see you, Shankar.
Couple of comments more than questions. You mentioned that you opted to go in the direction of population weighting. That just goes against the principle of environmental justice. Yet you have kind of chosen to go that path, and you do that only for that particular endpoint, so it may not wash off the rest of the results. So, but on the other hand, you also made a comment saying that the way in which you have approached it, there's an inherent weighting of some of the indicators. And if you look across the band of indicators, it is primarily dominated by air pollution indicators in the context of exposure. So how do we resolve as we move forward that one media is not overplaying the other?
I think the first way to address your concern, which is an important concern, is to aggregate up to the tract level without population weighting, then score, and see what the difference is. How much of an effect does this have? That's certainly something we could do, and I think do relatively quickly. And that would help us get a handle on this. But you're right, we only use population in that one place, and we use it because in our sense of, we often use the Los Angeles area because that's where we understand things the best. And when we were looking at the hazard proximity metrics and understanding the areas sort of at the organic level that we do, it seemed that to us, we should be placing more concern in the areas where the most people were close to hazards, rather than areas that were just existed geographically and were close to hazards. So that was the intention of that population weighting. But your concern is a good one, and I think the first step is to go ahead and see how much of an effect it has on scoring. If it doesn't have a big effect on scoring, maybe it isn't important enough to do, because it certainly is a complicating factor. And so we'll do that and report back to you. And we always enjoy talking to you, so that will be a pleasant conversation.
Hi, this is Vanessa from OEHA. You mentioned that you were doing community engagement and outreach. My question to you is what is your approach to doing this, and what are your goals and implications from doing this?
So what are our goals and approach in doing outreach with communities? Well, the two kinds of outreach that we've really done, one is having communities involved in helping us think about choices of indicators and the way in which to use the indicators, and to share the interim results with them to get their perspective on the way we're using indicators, which ones we're using, and how the results are looking. And that's simply sort of been the way we've always done business when we're working on projects that are of community interest. And one of the difficulties in that negotiation has been the fact that oftentimes, or at least sometimes, we work with communities that are quite convinced that things are of a certain way. And if our results don't reinforce that, sometimes they're not very happy about it. And so we've worked very hard to try to maintain our objectivity and our reliability and honesty. And I think that's really paid off in the long run with communities, because although we may not always have the answer that they're looking for, we have one that they can trust. And we have been involving them in a transparent way in the work we've been doing. As far as the ground truthing, that actually was something that bubbled up from the community participants themselves, who said, you know what, this is an area that should be really high, but in your method it's not showing up very high. If I take you there, I can show you the hazards. They're there, but they're just not in the data that you're using. And so that's where the ground truthing really started, to try to take community wisdom and community experience and use that to sort of error check some of these secondary databases, which, let's face it, we can't error check them all. We can't check them all. And it was a way to engage them in the process as well. What we found is that the secondary databases generally are quite accurate and complete, but locally there may be some incomplete or inaccuracy problems that really affect at the local level what the scoring is. So that's an important thing to understand. It's also an important community observation and contribution to this whole process. And that's a good way, I think, to approach it as well, because they're doing serious work that informs this process, which is, to a lot of people, highly technical and not very accessible. Does that answer your question? I will say that, maybe my impressions are not very good, but I've found most community groups to be much more sophisticated in terms of their understanding than I had anticipated.
I just want to remind the public that they can send questions through this email that is posted, and I will now read some of the emails.
Could I add one more thing? I think a really welcome addition to community engagement for CalEnviroScreen and for either screening method and any sort of a screening method like this would be to have it available on the World Wide Web or available as Google Earth KML files so that people could actually look at the results in their local area and check the locations of facilities and that sort of thing and do it in a sort of a crowdsourced organic way. And I could imagine a website which would be there to collect their observations and collect their feedback as well, which could inform the researchers. So that's an idea that I think is very doable and would be one that would be equitable and welcome at the community level.
Okay, so the first question came from Natalie Hernandez. Why were industry data layers of dry cleaners and printing and publishing shops removed as a hazard proximity? What was the reasoning behind this?
The reason we dropped those were that over time, and actually over a relatively short period of time, the technology used in dry cleaning and the technology used in printing and publishing really has changed a great deal in a way that results in fewer emissions of air toxics. So we felt that those sorts of hazards were less of a concern than some of the other sorts of facilities that we use in the method. Because the method is open-ended and easily programmable, you could add them in if you wanted to, especially if there was a particular regulation or a particular concern where they were important. But we chose to take them out for that reason. Arsenio? Okay.
This is Arsenio with CalEPA. Just following up on Natalie's question on dry cleaners, because I was wondering, there's, as you shared, there's a lot of those dry cleaners that have been operating for a very long time, and I haven't checked recently, but with the potential environmental degradation of those dry cleaners and our ability to clean up that environmental degradation, there seems to be still an impact to the environment and potentially people there. And so, I mean, it's funny because I think Natalie and I were just talking about dry cleaners yesterday, so it's probably both on our mind, but that's something to consider. But as you said, definitely you could turn it off and on, but it's an awful lot of dry cleaners. And yeah.
We could add it in. Now, to add it in methodologically, we'd have to first do our error checking, and there's a lot of dry cleaners. And because dry cleaners are mostly concentrated in urban areas, we find that we had a lot less error in urban areas than we did out in rural areas. So that would work in our favor. But we'd want to do that first. And recognizing a dry cleaner in Google Earth Pro, even with parcel information, is tougher than, say, a gas station, which is much more obvious from the air. But it's a valid problem. And I think maybe the way to start it is to focus on one region where the concern seems the most dire and use that as an experiment and see how much of a difference it makes. And, we'd be interested in doing that. I certainly would be.
Our second question came from Jesse Marcus. It was mentioned that the new category of measuring heat island impacts increases during the summer months and would be tracked, assessed, impact areas quantified and mapped. Is it limited to only summer months? What about now significant stationary heat island sources that exist every day now 24/7 and would also increase during summer. Refineries production is also expanding every year. The EJ community of the Wilmington in the Los Angeles has 4 major oil refineries. The ports of the Los Angeles and Long Beach are expanding every year, more diesel trucks, trains, etc., using public freight transportation corridors.
In terms of the heat island question, the climate change impact question, our development of metrics there was really responding to work by the California Department of Public Health and others that were trying to link deaths and health impacts to heat stress events. And the higher nighttime temperatures during heat stress events are a big contributing factor there because people are not, they have less resilience if things don't cool down in the evening, and they're not allowed to sort of recover from the high temperatures of the day. So that's why we added that metric. But again, what we're using is information that we have as proxies for measuring the effects of climate change. And they can't be as accurate as we would like them to, but we hope that taken together, they're accurate enough and complete enough to allow us to screen and identify those areas of greatest concern. I don't understand the question that Jesse's asking, however, about the refineries. Maybe he could restate that question. But certainly, refineries and air toxics emitters that are associated with refinery activity are in the EJ screening method, and we're using the most current secondary data on those locations in doing our hazard proximity. And that's also what NADA uses, EPA NADA uses in calculating health risk. So the best data available is what we're using, and we've updated the current version of the EJSM to have the best available data.
Let me ask one question before you go back. Go ahead. So I know the drinking water layer was especially difficult to work on, and maybe for EJSM 4.0 you might. One of the things that is missing is the people use home wells for drinking water, and I know, for example, a friend in San Leandro, an urban area, has a home well. I have friends here in the city of Sacramento that have home wells, and I don't know if they're. I'm sure they're not easy to map out where they might be and where they're not. But I think of those as kind of as a very vulnerable source of water.
Well, we agree. And one of the things, now I'm not the expert in the water quality metric, but Rachel Morello-Frosch is, but I'll tell you that there are census tracts in the state for which we have no hard information on the community water source. And so what we did for those areas was assume that they are on groundwater and assume that they have high vulnerability. And of course, we don't know what to assume with them in terms of contaminant level because the water isn't tested. So what we've done is to err on the conservative side in terms of hazard and vulnerability for all of those areas for which we can't document the water source and where we assume it's groundwater. Your point is absolutely correct about some urban areas using local groundwater wells. I can think of areas in the Los Angeles area where it's the same thing. And again, we've got a data gap that we have to improve in order to try to capture those more effectively. But the news is probably going to be bad wherever we do capture that data. And that's why we've assumed that they are highly vulnerable. Actually, you want to speak for OEHA on the water quality? Okay.
No, that's a similar approach, relying on the groundwater data. There are other efforts. We are working on some other water-related stuff, and there is an effort going on to look at that data gap with respect to private wells. It's something that's obviously very contentious data behind somebody's private well, but the state and mainly I think OPR is really and DWR are really looking at some of those data sources. So hopefully soon we'll have better data on those private wells, but it's obviously very contentious. So my question was, since like, what's next? So we have these screening tools out there. They're providing us a lot of good information. Policy seems to be slowly catching or trying to, take into consideration these tools. But what's next? I think, the screening tools have done a good job of providing policymakers the opportunity to better prioritize certain things or certain investments or actions or whatever. But what's next for the screening tools, or is it simply something different that you view will help communities deal with these issues?
Well, screening tools like this, if they're being used, have to be kept up. You have to maintain them in terms of, updating them with updated information. The National Land Cover data set that we're talking about for these climate change indicators and so forth, that's updated every 4 years. And so there's a certain amount of effort in just keeping it current. And one of the things we've done in this project is to make keeping it current easier. There also will be a situation where new data will become available that could be either inserted into one of these categories or make up a new category. And so for the EJ screening method, we've tried to keep it very flexible in that way. I think that the concept that I shared before about encouraging public comment and feedback and checking would be another important one, because we've developed these screening methods. We think they're good, but we know that at a local level there may be some real disagreement with reality. And so we need a way to try to look at that and monitor that. And I think that the concerned communities who are already mobilized, or some of them that may not be, would be our best source of information there. So those are some of the what's next directions that I think would be important.
There's a lot of people.
When will people be able to, this is great. I mean, when will people be able to use it at a community level in an open way, like you mentioned, a website? When will that happen?
Well, actually working the EJ screening method is not something you could put in a website, but you certainly could put the results in, and it's scalable. So it's now totally in the hands of CARB, and they could expand it, use it, as they wish. I think the important thing at the community level is showing the results. And the baby step that we've taken is making that PDF document with all the maps statewide and all the regions available. But I think that something that is more sophisticated that could be done on the internet would be a logical next step. And I think that that's something that people would appreciate for CalEnviroScreen as well. And I know that OEHA has actually done some of that already, but I think making the data available to the public in a way that is convenient for them to look locally would be useful.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have about 10 to 11 questions on the webinar.
Sure.
So I think we should maybe balance it a little bit. That's okay? Right. So we have a question from David Holistus, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Could you please restate the reason or reasons why you recommend that the distributions of scores be evaluated on a region-by-region basis versus statewide? That's the first question. And the second one is choose the regional breakdown, and then why you chose the regional breakdown that of 13 regions.
Okay, good question. I'll answer the second one first. We selected the regional breakdown that we did because from a regulatory point of view and from an air basins perspective, these were the regions that we and CARB agreed together made sense in terms of scale and number and decision-making and regulatory activity within each of those regions individually. We think that regional scoring is important or preferable to statewide scoring for the following reason. Just as water availability and water demand is extremely variable in California, so is environmental hazard and vulnerability. There are areas that just in an absolute sense score much higher than the rest of the state, but that doesn't mean that there are areas in the state that don't score high from a statewide perspective, should be ignored or don't require additional attention and investigation. So regional scoring is a way to lift up those areas within a region that are the worst in the region, even if they're not the worst in the state. The other thing is the actual solutions or ways in which to address some of these problems often are regional decisions and not statewide decisions. So although we understand and acknowledge that CARB's job is to work in a statewide manner, there are regional decision makers or regional processes that could be informed from looking at regional scoring that would be more effectively informed in that way.
And I think the other reason that we do regional scoring is, each region has its own industrial makeup and industrial pollution problems, and that's, related to regional decision making. But, folks have brought up to us that the EJ issues being faced by those folks in the San Joaquin Valley are very different than those folks in the Bay Area, very different from those folks in Southern California. So it's not just even the regional decision making, but that these problems, the EJ problems, vary region by region in such a large state like California.
So stakeholders should have some flexibility in terms of the way that they think their EJ problems. And the EJ screening method has some flexibility in terms of the method and the metrics used and what you include. And it also has that flexibility of looking at things regionally.
Nancy Peffer, she says, excellent presentation, thank you. I am interested in the implications of the differences between EJSM, CES, and CEVA, which I'm not familiar with. Could you discuss what considerations might go into the use or choice of one of these models over the others? I assume there are no requirements, although CES is in a way backed in to the cap and trade program. But could policy decisions come out differently if they were based on one of these models versus the other? Should we worry about this?
Well, I don't think policy decisions should depend on any one of or all of these screening methods alone. The role of these screening methods is to inform decision-making and inform policy consideration. But the methods are different primarily because the investigators have taken different approaches in trying to characterize cumulative impact and vulnerability. And I think it's actually valuable to have different methods because they tell you slightly different things. And I also think it's important because we talk to one another and we make improvements in our own method because of feedback we get from our colleagues that are doing other methods. So I think that the screening methods generally, I think we're better off having a number of them and having good cooperation between people working on them and recognition that they are addressing things in a slightly different way and are giving us different perspectives on the questions we're asking. But I don't think they should be used alone to make a decision.
Hi, Vanessa with OEHA. So speaking of ground truthing as a result of community input, so border communities have raised concerns that there's impacts from Mexico. And so OEHA is looking into these environmental concerns and seeing if there are impacts, and if so, how can we account for them in our screening method? So is that something that you guys have gone concerns about? And if so, are you going to account for that as well, as there is no wall between Mexico and California?
We were talking about that this morning. I think that's an extremely important problem. And the way to address it is to try to get information from across the border. Some of that sort of information would be relatively easy to get, but other information might not be. And I'm not sure that ground truthing would be the answer to get the information that we're missing. But it is really important. It's incredibly distorting that border communities don't take into account the hazards that are right across the border in terms of the analysis and the scoring. And it's a problem that needs to be fixed.
Okay, Carla Blankmar, has a comparison been done looking at the land use maps developed for the urban footprint tool and the land use maps developed for the EJSM? If so, to what extent are these two correlated?
I'm not familiar with the urban footprint tool. I can tell you that we haven't made any land use maps other than taking the land use information and mapping it. So land use for us is an input, not something that we're mapping or interpreting by itself. We're just using it as an input to the EJ screening method. And as I mentioned, the sources of land use information vary depending on what part of the state. But we're using the best quality and the most granular information that's available in any part of the state that we're collecting data from. But I'd like to look into that particular tool and learn more about it.
David, I'm not going to pronounce it, Sean Brown? I did. Please say more about how the indicators you choose produce rankings that have real-world applicability in policy and resource allocation decisions.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question? I'm not sure I understand.
Please say more about the indicators you choose produce rankings that have real-world applicability in policy and resource allocation decisions.
Okay, well, I'll use an example, perhaps, in a way to address that question. The City of Los Angeles is currently considering a land use ordinance that addresses the location and the cumulative impact of certain types of businesses that are responsible for emissions of air toxics. And our hazard proximity metric is useful in informing that sort of particular decision. So I think that there are pieces of the EJ screening method or pieces of any screening method that might be more applicable to a particular problem than others. And so the flexibility to drop those in and out is all the more useful for that reason.
Amy Kyle says, thanks for the presentation and all of your great work. Do any of the metrics capture groundwater plumes and the future trajectory of groundwater plumes? A second related question would be those with potential for vapor intrusion. I didn't hear this, but the audio broke up for me at some point.
I don't think any of our metrics capture vapor intrusion, but the water quality metrics do include sampling of groundwater and the comparison of the concentrations to the MCLs. So it does capture that in a way. I know that leaking underground storage tanks are one of the metrics that are used in CEVA. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure what else I could add to that, but certainly groundwater pollution and what is known about it is important. What's difficult from a screening perspective is to have that information statewide in a manner that's equitable geographically. We might know a lot more about groundwater contamination from an underground leaking source, for example, or a pipeline in one area, but not know about that everywhere to that same level. That's what makes it hard in putting into a screening method.
Emily Potter, also in regards to heat stress, have you been able to find any data that indicates the presence of air conditioning cooling units at the tract level, especially in the case of disadvantaged communities? This seems like it could be a vulnerability indicator.
A number of researchers that look into the mortality from heat stress or health impacts from heat stress have reported that people say that they have air conditioning, but they can't turn it on because they don't feel like they can afford it, or they don't have air conditioning. And again, getting that information that is reliable on a statewide level for all areas would be the challenge. But I know that that kind of information has been collected by survey for some areas. That would be a really important contribution for vulnerability and resilience.
So that's all the questions we've got from the webinar, but maybe some more will come up. Is there any other internal ones? No? Well, it doesn't seem like we're getting any new ones from the webinar. We'll give them a few more minutes maybe, or oh, here we have a question. Any Walker would.
Hello. Walker Whelan, Oiha. Thank you for a great presentation. The climate change indicators, I was thinking just a little bit about urban heat island, impervious cover, tree cover, then also the max nighttime temperature. Did you look and see if those had any relationship with one another, or if they were correlated? I was just sort of thinking through this idea of a lot of impervious cover, soaking in sun, getting warm, and then feeling that overnight, and maybe that pavement not cooling down as much, potentially contributing to that temperature. So just curious.
Yeah, we didn't look for co-correlation, but that would be easy to do and a good thing to do.
It's actually our next step. We are going to be looking at that
sensitivity analysis on
right now. Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you.
So we will let you know what we find.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But yeah,
Thanks.
that's a great point.
Mm-hmm. I think that does bring up an important point that has been brought up before, which is these metrics are not all independent of one another, and separating out those combined effects is really difficult.
Jason Meggs with CARB. Just curious if you've seen much variation within the smaller spatial areas of analysis. Say if you were to look in detail within, would you find almost like a, other side of the tracks phenomenon where one side is bad, one side is good, or, to what degree are we not getting a fine enough resolution?
Well, our spatial resolution is really defined by census tracts because so much of the information is only available at the census tract level. Whether or not the patterns at a large scale reflect fence line or across the tracks or whatever relationships, that's something that probably people with local knowledge would probably be the best ones to investigate that. But one thing that makes us feel good is that when we have showed the maps and showed the data to community groups that really do know their own area, they've generally said that it seems to be an accurate reflection of their understanding of the distribution of hazard and vulnerability. So that makes us feel good, and it gives us confidence that we've got something that reflects reality. We've yet to find someone to have a response of, this makes no sense at all.
Okay, so I want to thank Madeline and Jim. So let's give them an applause, and thank you very much. Thank you for coming and taking the time.